watching the Auteur Theories, a series examining the lives and films of cinema's most unique and gifted artists. This is part one of a two-part look at the career of Danish auteur Nicolas Winding Refn. Nicolas Winding Refn is one of cinema's most intense and uncompromising filmmakers. At 42 years of age, he has directed 10 feature-length films. Refn's films tell stories about the lives of misfits, gangsters, and obsessives, with honesty, human insight, and sympathy. For Refn, filmmaking should be an organic process. He avoids storyboards and insists on shooting his films in chronological order. This allows the filmmaking process to become the means of discovering the film itself, and helps his actors establish and maintain a consistent emotional thrust for their characters. His films are always rooted in the traditions of the gritty and violent genre cinema he grew up on, but always stubbornly refused to obey genre conventions, a fusion of classic, hard-edged genre archetypes with what he calls his feminine European sensibility. At just 26 years of age, the smashing success of Refn's debut film Pusher injected new life in the moribund Danish film industry, helping to inspire a new wave of low-budget documentary-styled humanistic cinema. Yet, after his third film, the experimental thriller Fear X, his career was nearly destroyed by seemingly insurmountable financial troubles the production of the film burdened him with. Refn persevered, though, staging a risky and stunning comeback that has propelled his career from European art house to Hollywood. Nicolas Winding Refn, or Yang as he's also known, was born into a filmmaking family in Denmark in 1970. His father, Anders Refn, is a prolific editor and director, and his mother, Vibeke Winding, a cinematographer. At the age of 8, his parents divorced and Nicolas moved to Manhattan with his mother and stepfather, where he lived for the next 9 years, essentially growing up a New Yorker. Refn is dyslexic and did not learn how to read until he was 13 years old, so it was through the visual language of cinema that he learned to interpret the world. And when he saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at a revival at New York's Cinema Village as a teenager, it had a profound influence on him, igniting a lifelong obsession with exploitation and horror films that the rebellious Refn used to shock his hippie parents. In 1987, Refn moved back to Denmark after dropping out of an acting school in New York to complete his high school education. A few years later, he caught a showing of Kevin Smith's no-budget comedy Clerks, and was inspired by Smith's DIY aesthetic to make a short video in which he cast himself as a criminal in the Danish underworld. Based on the kinetic power of this short, which was played on late-night cable TV, producer Henrik Danstrup offered to find the money to finance a feature-length version. Refn, who was just 24 years old at the time, had never made a feature film or even written a script before. In fact, Refn had just been accepted into the Danish Film Institute and had to make a choice between a coveted seat at the exclusive film school or to make his first low-budget film. Armed with what he called the combination of arrogance and ignorance, he chose to make the film, and the result is his groundbreaking 1996 crime film Pusher, which remains one of the most astonishing debut features ever made.
Okay.
Pusher is about the unglamorous lives of people involved in the drug trade in Copenhagen. Shot in the Super 16 format using mostly available light, the film pulses with an urgent documentary immediacy that enhances the drama. Refn cast the intense and brooding Kim Bodnia as anti-hero Frank, who, after getting busted in a sting for dealing heroin, has to find the money to repay the amiable but dangerous Serbian gangsters he's in business with. Frank launches a brutal and increasingly desperate campaign, collecting old debts as the film progresses. The super tight shooting schedule eliminated the possibility of rehearsals, which gave scenes like these a matter-of-fact clumsiness and naturalism.
Jeg skal have mine penge nu. Jeg er lige snart, hvad jeg gider. Jeg skal have mine penge.
Refn originally wanted to make Pusher a slick and stylized film, in the vein of his short, which seems inspired by the explosive action cinema of John Woo. But the more he researched the subject, the more he realized that the opposite approach was necessary to express the sadness he saw in the people involved in the drug trade. He settled on new sources of inspiration, like Gillo Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers, and The Killing of a Chinese Bookie by John Cassavettes.
Is it I can't give you anything but love, baby?
And perhaps the most significant influence on Refn's early work, Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets. Frank would prove to be Refn's prototypical protagonist, a doomed, self-destructive and violent man who has difficulty relating with women. Refn's realistic approach to the material struck a chord with Danish critics and audiences, who lauded the film for its honesty and lack of heavy-handed moral judgment. Against all odds, a low-budget debut feature from an inexperienced 24-year-old had become a legitimate cultural phenomenon in Denmark. Pusher also allowed Refn to establish a stable of actors and crew who would prove vital in his future work, including Henrik Danstrup, who produced Refn's next 6 features, musician Peter Peter, director of photography Morten Suborg, editor Anne Ustrud, actors Slatko Bookic, and Mads Mikkelsen, who has gone on to become an international star. After the success of Pusher, Refn immediately set to writing his sophomore film, and it would be released 3 years later in 1999. It was called Bleeder, and Refn would rely on pretty much the same cast and crew from Pusher to make it. But that isn't to say that the film's a strict retread. In Bleeder, Refn experiments with new techniques and emotions. While Pusher locked us rigidly into the perception and consciousness of protagonist Frank, Bleeder branches out and explores the lives of a collection of misfit characters. Kim Bodnia returns as Leo, who learns that his girlfriend Louise is pregnant and is intent on keeping the baby. Leo appears to accept this life-changing reality, but then he begins to lash out at Louise in fits of violence. These episodes spark the anger of her unapologetically racist and vicious brother Louis. And an increasingly serious series of violent confrontations follow. The film contrasts this disturbingly dysfunctional relationship with the awkward but sweet romance between a seemingly autistic film store clerk, Lenny, played by Mads Mikkelsen, and a bookish yet beautiful waitress, Leah, played by Refn's real-life girlfriend, Liv Korfiksen. Lenny is one of Refn's least proactive characters, and his all-consuming obsession with cinema is based closely on Refn's own life.
Peckinpah, Jean-Rollin, Jacques Tourneur, Wes Craven, John Carpenter, Jack Hill, Richard Fleischer, Argento, Werner Herzog, Paul Morrissey, Ed Wood, John Waterside, John Suzuki, Stanley Kubrick, Fellini, Hitchcock, Don Siegel, Todd Browning, David Lynch, Jodorowsky, William Lustig, Doris Wistman, Nick Milke, Orson Welles, Ines Zero Honda, David Lynch, John Woo, Jackie Chan, Ross Meyer, Ray Dennis Stegler, Abel Ferrara, Joe DiMaggio, Terence Fisher, Tobe Hooper, Herschel Gordon Lewis, Umberto Lenzi, Tarantino, Paul Schaffer, Jess Franco, Roger Corman, Larry Cohen, Deodato, Mario Bava, Jack Arnold, James Wales, og den allernederste reol over mig.
The burgeoning romance between Lenny and Leah acts as a nice counterpoint to the violence at the center of Bleeder's other couple. But Refn stumbles a bit in the overly simplistic depiction of Leah. She doesn't seem to have a completely realized life of her own outside of being the object of Lenny's advances. In fact, both of Bleeder's female leads lack the depth of their male counterparts. This was probably due to Refn's youth and admitted inexperience with women. The strength of Bleeder lies in the rich stew of moral complexity it offers. Leo and Louis are both aggressively unlikable characters, yet either of them could also be the hero. Refn's insistence on creating complex characters that are not easily identifiable as either heroes or villains is a key factor into why his filmmaking has been so consistently gripping throughout his career. The production of Bleeder was difficult, according to Refn, because of a falling out between him and Kim Bodnia, whose real life was spiraling out of control as much as his characters. If this is true, maybe you can see it in Bodnia's performance, which is powerful and unhinged, but would be the last in a Refn film. But this setback hasn't stopped Bodnia from enjoying a comfortable career in Scandinavian cinema and television. With Bleeder, Refn demonstrated his ability to do something completely different than his previous film, yet instantly recognizable as a Refn film, a pattern that he would continue to follow in his subsequent work, with only one exception, but we'll get to that later. Despite receiving several award nominations by the Danish Film Academy, Bleeder was overlooked by Danish audiences and didn't achieve the same recognition that Pusher had. This, however, did not deter Refn from continuing his cinematic journey, which led him to America for the first time. Refn contacted his favorite beat writer, Hubert Selby Jr., the author of Requiem for a Dream and Last Exit to Brooklyn, and asked if he would collaborate with him on a film project. Refn thought that by associating himself with Selby Jr. and making an English-language film, that he would begin to achieve artistic credibility on an international level, something that he desperately wanted. Refn moved to Los Angeles and struggled for 3 years to launch and produce the result of their collaboration, the psychological thriller Fear X. What he didn't realize at the time, though, was that his fanatical devotion to the vision he and Selby Jr. had would nearly end up costing him his career. The stunning opening shot of Fear X both establishes its dark tone and explains its central dilemma, all without the use of traditional techniques of exposition. Fear X stars John Turturro as Harry, a mall security guard whose wife was murdered under mysterious circumstances. Harry becomes obsessed with finding the secret behind her death, poring over hour after hour of surveillance footage, eventually finding a clue that leads him to a small town in the frigid Midwest looking for answers. Refn abandoned the documentary immediacy of Pusher and Bleeder and created a film drenched in dark atmosphere and ambiguity, and he maintains it throughout most of the film. Clues, if they can be called that, are sparse and ambiguous, suggestions really that evoke possibilities in the minds of viewers rather than providing a path to definitive answers. Refn also uses some dark, horrific imagery in the film that perfectly fits into the tone. It is difficult to talk about Fear X without mentioning the work of David Lynch. The parallels are numerous. The domestic secrets, dark interiors, small-town conspiracies, and thick atmosphere of dread all recall Lynch's style, and Refn admits to being a huge admirer. Brian Eno's sparse and haunting score also recalls the work of Lynch's sound designers and musicians. But Fear X is much more than just homage to Lynchian style. After revealing perhaps a bit too much about the central mystery of Fear X, Refn deftly uses this information to establish one of his most interesting moral quandaries. The would-be antagonist, the decorated police officer Northrop, is perhaps the most conventionally normal character in a Refn film, the irony being that he might also be considered the villain, and the fantastically vague ending makes up for any moments where an excess of clarity might have spoiled the fun. The constant ambiguity of Fear X will not satisfy all tastes. Regardless, it is a film of remarkable restraint and commitment to atmosphere, a fantastic achievement for a filmmaker as young as Refn. Fear X premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2003 and unsurprisingly polarized critics and failed to make money at the box office. The result was disastrous for Refn, as his source of financing fell through as production began, which required him to personally guarantee the film financially. When the dust settled on Fear X, his production company NWR was bankrupt, and he was $1 million in debt, and still far from becoming an internationally recognized cinematic force. And it couldn't have come at a worse time personally, as his girlfriend Liv Corfixen gave birth to their first child during the production of the film, and now he had to worry about supporting a family. Though he had vowed that he would never produce a sequel to his biggest success, Pusher, he now faced the hard commercial realities of the film business, and reluctantly decided that returning to Denmark and to Pusher was the most viable way for him to get out of the financial crisis that haunted his family. In fact, he wanted to make 2 sequels back-to-back, and once he had gotten over the disappointment of breaking his vow, and the tremendous personal and financial pressure to outdo his biggest hit, he threw himself headlong into the production of the sequels. Pusher 2 and 3 provided Nicolas the opportunity to not only break free from the chains of debt, but to also create his most artistically accomplished films up to that point, films that would end up giving him the wider recognition he craved. Refn's initial reluctance to go back to Pusher was driven in part by his fear that he would fail to make a better film than the original. To combat this, he chose to make something completely different, based loosely on the problems Refn himself was facing at the time, being a new father with suffocating debt. Pusher 2 focuses on a minor character from the original film, Frank's chum Tony, played by Mads Mikkelsen, who at the time was quickly becoming Denmark's most bankable star. This opening sequence perfectly sets the tone for the film. Tony's pitiful attempts at asserting his masculinity, only to be humiliated in response. Tony, just released from prison, returns to the ranks of his father's criminal organization that he runs out of a shabby auto repair shop.
Hvad fanden der er, Mr. T? Der er han sgu. Der er Frank slut. Så, hvad laver de store?
Tony is the son who can't do anything right.
Hold kæft. Lidt gælder ham jo altid.
Even when he steals an exotic sports car and brings it to the shop as a trophy for his father, he is met with nothing but contempt. Imagine if The Godfather had been a documentary film that focused on Michael Corleone's weak, stupid brother Fredo, and you can begin to understand the feel of Pusher 2. Tony endures humiliation after humiliation from prostitutes, his compassionless crime boss father who detests him, and his coke-addled criminal associates and their girlfriends.
Store fuckhoved, mand. Hvad fanden tænker du på? Hvad? Få den bil ud. og det er en vis fart.
Tony's life is complicated when Charlotte, played by Anne Sørensen, claims that he is the father of her infant.
Jeg skal bare have penge de næste 18 år frem, du, og så lidt mere til.
Men altså, prøv, hvis du mangler nogle penge, så kan du nå nogle af mig, så.
Prøv at høre, du skylder, ikke? Er du klar over, hvor lang tid jeg har gået her og slidt, mand, og slæbt dig, jeg ved ikke hvad, mand? Tager du om det?
Hvorfor?
Fordi jeg har lyst til at ryge en smøg.
Hvad skal jeg gøre her?
Tag med benene. Du kræfter med dummere end dum, mand. Skal sgu da have ham under armene, mand. Hvad har du tænkt dig, mand?
His financial difficulties are further exacerbated when, because of a paranoid blunder by his moronic friend Kurt, Tony falls into debt with Milo and must plot and scheme with Kurt to come up with the cash.
Underarmen. Vent lidt, jeg skal lige tænke, mand.
Most of the supporting cast were first-time actors who were cast off the street in order to give the film a more authentic feel. He cast the parts based on instinct and worked closely with the rookie actors to help them exude their natural charisma.
Du skal føle dig fuldstændig løs. Nu har du selvfølgelig en baby, og det er svært at arbejde med, ikke? Det kræver mere.
Mads Mikkelsen's performance stands out as career best, creating a young man convincingly arrested in development, worthy of both contempt and sympathy. Although considered a mainstream film when it was released in Denmark, Pusher 2 is far from the safe conventions of commercial cinema as we know it in the US. It is not cinema as we aspire to be, but cinema as we actually are, our failures and weaknesses nakedly displayed. The relentlessly bleak tone of the film is dispiriting, but it can never be accused of being dishonest, and it contrasts beautifully with the ending, which is one of Refn's most positive, a fleeting glimpse of hope that resonates powerfully because of how well-earned it is. Pusher 2 would go on to win the Best Picture award from the Danish Film Academy in 2004, as well as picking up awards for Refn for Best Director, Mads Mikkelsen for Best Actor, and awards for editing and cinematography. A triumph for Refn, his most essential film because of its quality and because of how it impressed his financiers enough for him to get the go-ahead to make Pusher 3, thus saving his career. Pusher 3, however, would not be so warmly received by the Danish film community. In part 2 of this look at the career of Nicolas Winding Refn, we will discover how the critical reaction to Pusher 3 prompted him to vow to never make another film in Denmark again, and see how his path to create unique and personal cinema has led him to Hollywood.